Dr. Doug Rao and myself, Dr. Nikki Cooley, would like to welcome you to Lecture 5 on the title of Food for Thought. This lecture covers the area of agricultural production drivers, human nutrition and food security. This lecture is the fifth lecture of the subject Food Production in a Changing World, which is a component of the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology that is offered at both NMIT and Melbourne Polytechnic. Please visit our website at www.nmit.edu.au for further information about this course and the other courses that we offer. In this lecture we will cover two topics, that of human nutrition and food security, and how they are both a driver of change in agriculture. We will start by looking at the learning objective outcomes for this topic. I will then introduce food and nutrition, description and an introduction of food security. This would include the historical examples of food security and modern nutrition as a driver of change. We will look at food security from an Australian perspective as well as that of a global perspective. We will end the lecture by examining Australia's role in addressing food security issues, both within Australia and globally. And finally, we will summarise the drivers of change that make up both food security and nutrition. In Lecture 5, we will be exploring subject learning outcome number 3, investigation into issues of change and sustainability in global food production systems. We will be concentrating on that of food security and human diet. When you are talking about human nutrition and food security, you perhaps should start with a definition of food. Food is an edible substance, either of animal or plant, which is a source of nutrients which is ingested by other organisms in order to sustain life. You can add insects to that edible substance list. Nutrients is an essential substance that your body needs to grow and stay healthy. Nutrition is the science behind the food and the substances they contain. It details and tries to understand how the body reacts and uses these substances. And finally, dietary requirements are the amount of nutrients that are required for an individual to be healthy. So what does nutrition from an agricultural production driver standpoint mean? Well, in a modern day sense, we are capable of eating and consuming about 7,000 different plant species and approximately 2,000 animal and insect species. However, 98% of food production consists of just 12 plant species and 14 animal species. 50% of all the energy intake is provided by wheat, rice and maize. In the first part of this lecture, we're going to understand what we mean by food security. When you start to explore this topic, you will realise that defining and answering this question is perhaps not as simple as you first thought. So let's start by the basic concept. Surely food security is all about reducing hunger. Hunger that can occur from natural situations or hunger that can occur from political or governance situations. The images on the slide show some of the challenges and some of the capabilities from an Australian perspective. The image on the left-hand side is from the drought in 2009, and the image on the right-hand side is some of the produce that Australia is very capable of producing and does so regularly. Food is a fundamental human need. The access to food is a right of every human. This right was recognised by the UN in 1948 during the Declaration of Human Rights. One of the first things you need to understand is that food security is an evolving concept. That is, what it is meant by food security today is quite different to what it was meant at the beginning of the 20th century, which was again very different to to what it meant throughout the history of humans. One of the definitions which I think we will refer to here in this subject is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for a healthy and active life. This definition was composed by the World Food Summit in 1996. There is a relative scale of food security. You can either be food secure, food insecure without hunger, or food insecure with severe hunger. It is important that we understand where the components of this definition have evolved from. Firstly, the word enough is used, and this is quite relevant in the understanding of the definition. Enough infers that access to enough food ensures good food security, and this is not necessarily the case. To enable good food security, food needs to be sustainable. Food security can relate to water, sanitation and biodiversity, and a healthy ecosystem. Therefore, food security does not always relate to just the food nutritional content. In fact, when we begin to look at the history of food security, we will see in 1980 the definition was changed to add the availability of food from an economic point of view. That is, the food has to be affordable. And this was added to the definition. The definition evolved again in 1990, where it changed to lead to the inclusion of absorption of food. This is a nutritional component. In 2000, the inclusion of stability as a requirement for food security was added to the definition. This was followed in 2010 by the inclusion of nutrition. Nutrition was included because there were observations made of an increase in malnutrition in some women and some children in some areas in the world. Of the following list of food security, availability, access both physically and financially, healthy people, food supply and prices and stability in this, and nutritious enough to sustain the human body, I suspect two of these components, that is, healthy people and nutritious diets, will be very influential in the future of food security. There is much debate in this sector currently about what we mean as a nutritious food. There are some countries where food is freely available, and this food is very affordable. However, the nutritious content of such food is under debate. Excess fatty acids and high carbohydrate diets can lead to overweight, obesity, and an unhealthy diet. This can then lead to malabsorption. These are issues, I suspect, that will continue to confound the industry going forward. So put simply, you can think of modern-day food security as needing to have the following attributes: food availability, food access, and food use. Food security will be the greatest challenge to civilization this century, or at least so it is stated by many respected organisations. Food shortages will probably lead to higher prices, political instability within some countries and between other countries, and possibly mass migration issues. Food security is certainly a driver of agricultural production. Its influences, however, are complicated. It can influence land availability, resource use, consumer choice, governance, price, and product convenience. Production will have to note and be aware of nutritional content, accessibility, affordability, both in the production and the supply. In order to meet all of these requirements, good efficiencies will need to be undertaken in this industry. In the next few slides, I will detail some historical examples of food security The literature is scattered with many such examples, and you will see how these examples of food security have been a driver of change, although you will often see them cited in the context of a consequence of agriculture rather than a change to it. I am going to discuss these examples, the 17th to 18th century, the Irish potato famine, and agriculture and early modern agriculture. But please note, there are many, many more examples. There was a real mix of drivers of change through the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the most predominant drivers of change was that of hunger. This was evidenced by food riots. Many regions of the world witnessed these food riots. They were recorded in Europe, Mexico, and China. Grain seizures occurred in many locations during the 18th century in Europe. These seizures occurred on farms, highways, and canals. Riots would often break out in markets and bakeries. Daily price rises occurred, which meant many families could not afford bread. Shoppers would demand a price for the produce that reflected the value they could afford. If the baker did not reciprocate, the shoppers would storm the shop, leaving the money that they thought the product was worth rather than the money the shopkeeper wanted. In France, this process had a term. It was called taxation fourrière. In China, the situation was interesting. Crowds of hungry people would regularly loot storehouses and blocked rice shipments, despite the fact that China had the most comprehensive granary system in the pre-modern world. Famines were common in Western Europe during the 17th century. This was a suggested driver of agricultural change by the 18th century, as agriculture had changed and better market structure existed, and therefore improvements were witnessed. The changes that occurred from the 17th to the early 18th century led to the reductions in chronic hunger, and infant mortality dropped. After agricultural change started to occur, this enabled the hunger issue to be in some part addressed. People's expectations then changed. People's or consumers' expectations became a driver of change. They no longer wanted the plain subsidies that were offered, but wanted more. Populations were also a driver of agricultural change during this period. Food distribution networks were observed as a driver of change. If the poor had no legal entitlement to grain, then hunger resulted. This led to social unrest and social inequity. So as you can see from this snapshot, a real mix during this period. The changes were witnessed by the price of food during this time. For example, during periods of non-famine, the price of food was determined by market price. When periods of famine came along, governments were morally bound to intervene in the market and set subsistence for the poor. Societies during this era were highly hierarchical in nature, and they required government intervention to ensure stability. The social changes that occurred during this period, along with the extension of commercialization of agriculture, led to significant change. For example, movement of the changes into rural Europe at this time resulted in a larger migration of workforce. Subsistences also changed. Riots occurred when rare grains were moved from the rural areas to the city. It might be hard for us to imagine that the wish of governments to ensure social stability resulted in drivers of change during this period. I want to now talk briefly about the Irish potato famine, which occurred in 1846 to about 1850. Some climatic events, that is, prolonged periods of rain and frost, laid down the ideal conditions for the American fungus Phytophthora infestans, or more commonly known as potato blight. These conditions were ideal for this disease to proliferate in the potato. This led to a significant reduction of the number of potatoes being farmed during this period. This was devastating to the Irish communities. It led to disease, hunger, and death. It is approximated that over 100,000 people died of nutritional disease or starvation in the 1850s. Perhaps one of the greatest ironies around this period was that the grain industry was massively successful. Food was shipped from Ireland to England. So while the Irish were dying in situations of hunger, it was politics that enabled this situation largely. If we look at agriculture and early modern agriculture in the 19th century from a food security perspective and drivers of change, we will notice that there were some other changes in the area which have impacted on the ability for the food to become secure. What I mean by this is industrialization has radically changed food production. Transport infrastructure has allowed new global markets, again changing the food security environment. There have been massive changes to supply networks. The cooking has been removed from the home in many countries into commercial kitchens, and there's a wide-ranging social implications that have also impacted on food security. And finally, there are impacts on agricultural labour. In the 19th century, we saw a great change to nutritional components of food, and we will discuss here how they linked with food security. So, for example, you saw stable production, low food prices of such products as bread and beer. You had the introduction of processing techniques such as canned vegetables and frozen vegetables. When you look at these stated products from a nutritional perspective, you may come to a range of conclusions. Your first conclusion may be that bread can act as a staple and a good energy supply for the population. It is easily transported and can be sold, and often is sold quite cheaply. When we look at such articles as canned vegetables, there are positives and negatives from a nutritional standpoint. Some vegetables, such as carrots, nutritionally have a higher value in a can, but many lose some nutritional value if they've been stored and processed in such way. Frozen vegetables are considered more desirable from a preservation perspective and nutrition. Again, they're not as good as the fresh product, but if it means no vegetables or frozen vegetables, then from a nutritional standpoint this is good. Now we will consider nutrition and food security as a modern agricultural driver. We will look closely at how diet choices act as a production driver of modern agriculture. Nutrition, and more importantly our understanding of nutrition, has come a long way. Now we not only consider nutrition from an energy standpoint, but there are many considerations in our modern day diet. The image on the slide is a snapshot for some of these considerations. Diet can be thought of as a way of handling and aiding health in such diets that enable you to manage osteoporosis and cancer, for example. Diets can be centered around counting calories, so you reduce the amount of energy that you intake. Special diets like the CSIRO protein diet have been developed to enable a more healthy lifestyle. Diets can be guided by religion or by a wanting to have healthy children. In modern day time, diets tend to be driven mostly by convenience and or price point. That is, how much can the consumer get for their dollar. Other drivers that dictate diet can be that of the allergy and intolerance or alternative food industries. Examples of this are gluten-free markets or the histamine market, and these are on a significant increase both across the world and in Australia. Diets can be led by fun and fashions. And finally, diets can be proven
or altered by ethics of the inputs that underpin their production. What I mean by this is diets can be changed if the resource management characteristics are not considered favourable. Food miles for some people are now a consideration for diet. Native food programs have also been considered as a way of enabling good diets and enabling climate change adaptation, and also producing food in a low carbon manner is also a driver for food security and changing and evolving diets.
So, looking at food security from an Australian perspective, who suffers or experiences food insecurity in Australia? Well, a staggering 5% of the Australian population is currently experiencing food security issues. I say a staggering 5% because we think of developed countries as not encountering such issues, but this simply isn't true. Of this 5%, the following list is who is impacted by food security issues. 24% are Indigenous peoples, 23 are the unemployed, 23 are single-parent households, 20% are low-income earners, 20% are rental householders, and 15% of this cohort are young people. For Australia, the issues leading to food insecurity tend to be around the following: issues available income or isolation and or knowledge, not generally a physical sufficiency issue. Australia produces 93% of domestic agricultural consumption. Looking at this statistic, you wouldn't think there was an issue of full food insecurity in Australia.
So what does food security to the Australian farmer look like? Well, the article in the Herald Sun, while not a complete and accurate resource of all the components of Australian farming and food security, do highlight some important ones that we shall consider. So currently, Australia has the capacity to feed double its population. The capacity of farming and farming production is falling. One of the biggest risks to food security in Australia is not necessarily being able to feed its people, but being able to compete with the global market.
If we look at national food security, one of the issues that often comes up, at least in the media, is how does foreign ownership affect Australian security? Well, let's have a look at some of the facts and information around this area. On a governance level, foreign investment in Australia is generally encouraged. It requires ministerial approval. It requires this ministerial approval if the investment is greater than 15% share, the assets are greater than 244 million. And while this 244 million may seem like a large amount, this is fairly restrictive by OECD standards. The issues that are stated as being considered are national security, competition, contribution to economy, tax and environment, supply chain, community concerns, and governance. So let's have a look at some current estimations of foreign investment in Australia and see how far the issue is, if it is indeed an issue. So the level of foreign farmland and agro-business ownership is estimated at 11% of cultivated land by the ABS. It is estimated that 99% of agro-businesses are owned locally and not by foreign investors. The few foreign-owned investors are likely to be high-end enterprises. The motivation for investment of foreign-owned businesses is currently stated as either a business investment, to divert from domestic to export markets, or to bypass world commodities markets. In the future, reasons may become more complex. Countries such as China may start investing in a larger proportion due to a lack of natural resources in the country, or having a larger population than their land mass can sustain. The figure on the slide shows a breakdown of Australian land ownership by enterprise. The first thing I wish you to note is that the bottom x-axis units start at 88% and not that of 0, and go up to 100. It is important to note this, otherwise your interpretation of the data may be skewed. The data is based on statistics collected in 2010. The graph suggests that foreign investment is residing in such industries as sheep, beef, cattle and grain farming over that of other industries such as deer, mushroom, vegetables or nursery productions. So what is the situation of global food security? Well, it's quite sobering. 1 million people currently are recorded as undernourished. This is a staggering number of people considering there is physically enough food. But poverty reduces purchasing power. There are deficiencies in transport infrastructure, and political instability can all lead to compounding food security issues. Food insecurity is likely to be exacerbated by population growth, the growing scarcity of arable land and usable water for agriculture, increased soil degradation, and climate change effects. So, what is Australia's role in addressing global food insecurity? Well, Australia is a large exporter. It exports 60% of agricultural production. So, from an Australian perspective, we're in a very strong position. In a global term, however, we are a modest producer. Australian agriculture production is estimated to feed about 60 million people. Moreover, the destination of the exports are driven by the free market forces and not by the need to feed starving people. The transfer of technical information and skills, particularly that of high-efficient dryland farming, may have much greater and sustained impact than food production itself. So, in other words, it's our expertise and our knowledge that is the most valuable in us addressing global food insecurity, and for that role we can make a significant impact. So let us sum the drivers of agricultural change that we have discussed in this lecture. There is diet, which includes choice, knowledge, nutritional content, health and disease prevention and management, fashions, society and hierarchical status, price, probably very important for Australia, convenience, seasonality, ethics of food production and sustainability of food production. Food security aspects are complex and forever changing. One can summarize these currently as availability of foods, the cost of food production, and the distribution for global markets. So, after listening to this lecture, you should be able to understand or do the following. Define food, nutrition, and food security. Understand that food security has an evolving nature. Be able to give some examples of historical food security issues versus modern-day security issues. Understand the role of nutrition in food security. Understand the role of resources and how they feed into the food security debate. Understand the role of diet choices in current-day food security. You should be able to describe food security from an Australian perspective and also food security from a global perspective. Finally, you should be able to understand how food security is a driver in agricultural production, but the impacts can be complex and evolving. This brings us to the end of this lecture.